Next up is our public policy panel, where we're going to invite to the stage, we have Christopher Clark, who's a senior scientist from Cornell University. We have my colleague from Intertrust, Thomas Sander, who is an expert in privacy-preserving technologies. Many of you may have arrived here today on Muni, and we have here the CTO of Muni, who has a fascinating story related to ransomware that she dealt with during the first week of her job. And then we have the CEO of Enotech Consulting, Michi Kaifu, and that will be all moderated by James Miller, who is a lawyer with a very specific focus on telecommunications regulation and policy. So I'd like you all to welcome the policy panel as they come to the stage. Thank you.
Wow, what an outstanding introduction for a policy discussion. Thanks very much to Professor Lin again. We're talking about policy and as it relates to how trust and trustability is regulated. And I think what we want to do today is talk a little bit about how policy is an emergent feature in many ways of technology and the sorts of innovations that are driven from what's possible. And oftentimes those differ depending on the sector. Sometimes from transportation we'll hear some examples. Of course, telecommunications and internet technology offer a lot of the driving sort of features here. But also there's a strong component of consumer behavior and business practices. And I think we'll also get a good feel for how the panel sort of views both the differences in culture and how consumers or perceptions around business behavior or government can influence the kinds of emergent policy features that we see. And in addition, how those can differ not only across industry sectors, but also across jurisdictions within a state or across national boundaries. I think Professor Clark probably has seen a few of these problems sharing data across different sources in the context of studying marine mammals, particularly whales, and distributing sensors across seas and oceans. It seems like a fairly innocuous problem. Observational data, you collect it, you do some research, but I think you were sharing that it's a little more complicated than that.
Is this on?
Should be.
Yeah, it certainly gets complicated when you're dealing with large distributed arrays of underwater sensors that were installed by AT&T to track enemy submarines on ocean scales. This gets into a serious national security issue. It deals with the definition of the word data, which I'll talk about. But it also expands into how do you deal with large dimensional scales that are very difficult to comprehend and explain to the public and the people that make decisions?
So we're talking a little bit about the definitions, and of course, Professor Lin was speaking to this in some sense. What we call things makes a difference across different domains. Whether or not we're talking about privacy, which a lot of people interpret to be sort of a high-level concept, something that's driven oftentimes by the basic laws, in our case, in the US, the Constitution. And then in other cases, as we drill down, the specifics tend to take a different flavor, whether we're talking about personal information, for example, in the Japanese context, or we're talking about data protection, maybe from the EU. How is it, from your experience, sort of useful to focus on what are people really trying to produce? What are the outcomes that people are focused on? And how does that naming sometimes, have an important role?
Okay, so fundamentally I'm a biologist, engineer, scientist who works on environmental issues, large-scale environmental issues. So as I'll get into, the definitions and uses of words are often the obstruction, as well as I think many of you have had this experience. It's not about the knowledge, it's about egos, bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm astounded.
Yeah. So the impediment here is not our ability to be creative and inventive and do technology. To me, the impediment is the inherent, if you will, inertia of our social systems.
And I think there's a little bit more sort of around this topic of data in your slides. I think if we can click through a couple here.
Yeah, I'm going to get up and, can I?
Sure. You probably want to take the mic.
These on? Great. Do I, no.
You're about 5 minutes in. So.
Is there a clicker? How do I advance? Is there a way to advance the slides? Is it this? Okay. I'm interested in the so what type questions and also in emergent properties of large living systems. Today I'm going to place these under the rubric of data security, initiated from my own historical perspective as a bioengineer scientist, conducting observations on human impacts of marine life over ocean basin scales and multi-decadal temporal scales. I'd like to show you links between what should be considered as basic research and discovery through the scientific process and other fundamental components of the data security challenge. I'll discuss two intrinsic challenges. The first involves terminologies and definitions. The second challenge is to do with dimensional scales, as I mentioned before. What do we mean by data and data security? Terminology, getting these definitions right are necessary for effective data sharing between people and across systems, which in turn drive effective synthesis and interpretations of data and data derivatives. We often refer to those as products or reports or whatever. I directed a large academic-based research program at Cornell University, and I intentionally built intersections with industry clients and government clients. The definition of the term data is different in each of these domains. For example, in industry, data were the raw materials as well as some of the selected data derivatives. For academia, data means everything. It depends upon who you talk to. Well, sort of, maybe, kinda. It depends upon if I'm talking to the head of risk management or I'm having a discussion with a provost. For the Department of Commerce and the Department of the Interior, data means whatever was needed at the time. For the Department of Defense, it depended, and I'll explain that in a bit. To solve the industry academia problem, I had to define data as the raw material, bits and bytes, and I did not care about data ownership as long as I had total access to a copy of the data and uninhibited rights to publish. To solve the DoD academia dilemma, I learned to define data as the raw bits and bytes, time-varying waveforms that might hold acoustic events of high national security interest, but anything derived from the analysis of those data, I learned to define as a report, literally a 6-letter word, R-E-P-O-R-T. If I labeled it as a report, it wasn't necessarily classified. Thus, solutions to data security were mostly about words and definitions, not about substance. I don't know if this resonates with any of you. And then the Data Act comes along about open data requirements. This threw another monkey wrench into the works. When the Department of Commerce or Interior wanted me to provide open access to all the data, they did not actually mean the petabytes of raw data. They only meant an Excel file. That was considered a database. An Excel file listing the raw data and some examples of the data products. These could be found in reports. These exercises with the word data exposed other terminology issues, such as the definitions of open data, data access, and data security. There was no uniform terminology usage. What's interesting to me is that the proximate bottlenecks relative to data access and data security were mostly about language, bureaucracy, and ego. But the fundamental motivations for me in this case and drivers of the research were ultimately about human impacts on the natural environment, things like changes in densities and distributions of marine resources, from krill to fish to whales. These motivations were driven by concerns about the significant influences and impacts of present human actions on ocean life. I know that these might seem a bit abstract and esoteric to some of you, but these fundamental underpinnings are fundamental underpinnings of our national security. This environmental concern is real because of the global scales of our influences and impacts on living systems. Let me explain with another example. This is the next challenge. Yeah, okay. Getting your scales right is absolutely necessary for effectively observing emergent properties. Here we have another inherent problem because humans have a difficult time moving seamlessly through a conceptual multidimensional space that involves exponentially defined scales. Our institutional constructs, academic, technical, business, political, you name it, are not adapted for such concepts and scales, let alone for elucidating emergent properties. Small scales and short attention spans are the norm. I'm sure you're aware of this, almost by definition. You got the 8-second elevator ride. How do you know where and when national security is critical if you do not understand which parts are most vulnerable? Which have the greatest degrees of uncertainty, and under what conditions different types of risks occur? In today's world, with an N of 1 planet, there is absolutely critical need for secure data at large spatial, temporal, and technical scales. I'll end with this perspective. How do we assess inherent uncertainties, the risks, and the opportunities associated with that data security, or lack thereof, under present conditions? I would offer that much of our present conundrum has been and remains determined by some initial conditions set 30 or 40 years ago, technical, social, intellectual, etc., that these persist into the present. Some of these are most certainly outdated. The cost, decision, choice fulcrum appears simple, but if we don't get it right, entropy increases, the heat in the kitchen goes up, normal is presently adrift, in case none of you have noticed, and the baselines are shifting so fast that the timescales of our learning are falling behind our consequences. Thus, security is absolutely essential and multidimensional, and at multidimensional scales. This is not hypothetical or theoretical. It's real. It's happening now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. I think for many of us, open data is probably a pretty familiar word, but the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act of 2014 came out of other work preceding that a number of years, but certainly the open data policy that you mentioned, which came around 2013, made some changes, of course, to how, for example, federal research that's funded under some conditions has an obligation to make data available, and that sharing certainly implicates a lot of stuff. Lisa, I know, of course, the Bay Area has been very active in the field of what is now described open data. Naturally, transportation sector has been a very big driver. Of course, Mr. Lin talked about telecommunications data sources as really critical for doing a variety of research, and then, of course, transportation data is also really difficult. Chris was talking to the challenges of sharing data at the observational level across, say, DoD domains, and then how that changes with the open data policy. But I imagine you probably have some insights as well, given that you span many jurisdictions in the San Francisco municipal transit system. What are some of the challenges that you've dealt with sharing data across those domains, and what are the strategies?
Thanks, James. We have many challenges, and that's one of the reasons why security and privacy are utmost and forefront in everything that we're beginning to work on within the SFMTA. Just a little bit about SFMTA, and a lot of people don't realize that we're not just Muni. We also manage, while we do the transit system, the trains, the buses, we also do all the streets. We do the traffic signals, the parking garages, the parking meters, all the things that mean transportation in the city and county of San Francisco. And that's a little unique in the US, as well as in Europe and Asia, to be honest, and they're just starting to bring these types of agencies together, which if you think about it, make a lot of sense, particularly when you talk about sharing data and trying to really provide a service that allows people to move around the city, which is really what we're talking about, is the movement of people through their day-to-day lives throughout their destinations from point A to point B. So I want to make that point too, because it speaks to the data that we have and the access to the data that we have and all the areas that we can bring together, which also impacts privacy in certain areas as well. But to James's point and to Chris's, we are an open data environment. We have the City and County of San Francisco provides a platform for SF open data. We share our data, and that's not just the SFMTA, but every agency that's part of the city government is part of this open data platform. And primarily we share the raw data. There are certain instances where we make a determination to share it in a report. You mentioned the format of a report, which then in my mind becomes less data in my mind and more information. And I make that distinction because it's important to understand we've got plenty of data from sensors, from traffic signals, from vehicles, from video, from all these different areas, but it is just that. It's data, and it's not really functional until it becomes information to somebody. And it's really important to understand what that information needs to be on the output so we know how to architect it to meet the security and privacy needs in the beginning. And with that, I'd like to say how I think about and my team thinks about making sure that we adhere to the regulations that we have to abide by. And we're regulated by the federal government, by the state government, and local governments, along with some of specific regulations and compliance needs we need to adhere to for particular federal funding, which are different than other areas as well, and from certain bond initiatives and so forth. So we have a lot of different compliance and regulatory restrictions and guidance that we have to adhere to. So in order to make sure that we're gathering all this stuff appropriately and managing it, not just for our own use, but to ensure that we have some trust from the citizens of the city and county that we're pulling this data together, and also from other agencies within the city that we want to share data with. As you can imagine, we have video all over the city. And as part of the SFMTA, we have video at street corners, on vehicles, in parking garages, and all these kinds of areas as an example. And you can imagine that one area, and it was spoken about earlier today, is law enforcement. When there's an incident within the city, what do they need? They need the video. And we're one of the prime areas to do it and to provide that video. But we also have to assure the trust of the public that we're managing that information and that data appropriately, and assure law enforcement that we're managing it appropriately for them as well. So to do that, we really have to think of privacy and security, and I like the way we're distinguishing between the two because they are very different. I can secure any piece of data. That doesn't mean I'm adhering to any privacy for it. When I think about that, I really have to look, when we initiate something, designing up front the privacy and security standards that need to be had. I need to understand through a system engineering type of development practice that we're designing in what that information is, or what those data elements is more specifically, and then how it's going to be used as information. And then I can start to understand how to plan and architect for security and privacy on the back end.
So Lisa, if we could just pause on that point a moment, because I think, probably in the privacy by design panel later, the word data minimization will probably emerge. And I think you had mentioned that at sort of the raw observational level, you guys take great pains to minimize the kind of information that is associated with particular sorts of scenarios, namely an individual or something that would sort of serve as a quasi-identifier, if you will. If you could maybe
exactly.
give a little more insights on that, how that influences.
My tenet in principle is I don't want to own anything type of thing, and I certainly don't want to have extra stuff. I don't need to know that it's Susie on the 47 taking her children to daycare and dropping her off, and that her child's name is Jane, and they're going. I don't need to know any of that. I don't even need to know that they are going with 2 other children. I just need to know that there are a certain number of people taking this pattern of travel. I need to understand I need to understand the patterns. I need to understand the movement of people. I need to understand how that traffic signal is inhibiting or not inhibiting the flow of traffic and pedestrians in the city. I try to minimize and not own any personally identifiable information, and if I have to, for whatever reason, I need to make sure that that is separate from any other key identifier, and that's when I talk about the designing up front and understanding that in my data, I have to have these data lakes that separate information and make sure it's architected in that way.
And I think you talked about sort of how you gateway between those lakes, and to the degree that you've got some like transactional data. Then how is that handled again?
Yes, on the transactional side, like I said, we handle parking meters. When you need a temporary sign for a street closure or a street event, that's all coming through us, and those are all fees. Permitted parking, all those types of these are fees. So we do have PCI type, for those of you who are local, which means credit card information and so forth. We try never to handle that data. I never want to see a credit card number. I never want to see that within our data sets. That is all gatewayed and handled by a third party that do those kinds of things. We make sure we have the right paper in place between us to make sure that we really don't see any of that and that they're wholly responsible. And the elements that we do need, we pull back in anonymized.
And so that, of course, the privacy sort of law and regulation that's in place permits that kind of segmentation. And I think one of the discussions that you hear sort of across, especially regional borders, is how well the policy enables these sorts of business strategies or technical architectures. In your case, you're dealing with a number of municipalities, all different sorts of sources of law, but I can imagine that it's even more complicated, if you were to introduce sort of an international component to it. Thomas, if we could maybe speak to, of course, any entity that's working with Europe or interacting with Europe. There's, of course, new data protection rules that have come into force. And naturally, the discussion in the United States, I think a lot of scholars will say maybe dates back to 1972 with the Q Committee that established the Fair Information Practices and a number of sort of 5 features that data should be not secret, it should be open to inspection, that the use should be controlled, and consent should be part of how it's used. These sort of features, I think, are sort of a common theme through the last 20 or 30 years of policy, but certainly Europe has been very active in the area of data protection in particular. What are some of the challenges that you might face working in that context? What are some of the policy sort of backgrounds that folks should know about? If we could tee up his slide, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. So yes, so Europe has been working on the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, which is probably one of the largest changes in the global privacy landscape for close to 20 years. And some of the...
You could flip back the slide.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is it. So, and this legislation is going to be enforced May 25th, 2018. So this is coming up fairly soon. And there are a number of challenges related with that legislation, including for international companies, for American or Japanese companies who we have here. And one of the reasons is that this legislation has an increased, this regulation has an increased territorial scope. So if you're a European company, of course, you have to abide by these rules. But also if you're, for example, a US company, an American company who is delivering goods and services to European, to people in Europe, you also have to follow these rules, at least for those data that pertain to this European people. And that means that a lot of American or Japanese or other global companies have now also to put efforts into place in order to adapt their regimes, their privacy regime to these European rules that are laid out in the GDPR. And this legislation also has teeth, so people really have to do this. And one of the reasons is that there are tough penalties for if you violate these rules. So for example, there are up to 20 million euros or 4% of your annual turnover in the case of serious violations. So that, of course, makes many companies very nervous about what could happen to them if they are found to be in non-compliance with the European law rules. So it requires comprehensive changes, which presents a number of challenges, not just for European companies, but also for US companies. And they need to make significant changes in their business practices and also in their technologies. So I'm leading the GDPR. I'm a technologist. I'm not a lawyer or a policy person, but I've been doing research in the area of privacy and security technology for close to 20 years. But I'm also leading privacy efforts at Intertrust, and I'm also leading the GDPR task force for this transformation. So some of the major changes that the GDPR is bringing and that we have to implement is, for example, accountable privacy management. So there's a very strong accountability principle within the GDPR, and what that means is that it's no longer just sufficient that you're doing the right thing, you also have to produce evidence and to prove that you're doing the right thing. And that means you have a number of record-keeping obligations, you have you need to document the various processes that you follow. There are several things that are written in the GDPR, including, for example, security is to be, the level of security you're providing has to follow a risk-based approach. So it needs to be proportional to the risk, not to the corporation as we would normally do it, but proportionate to the risk to the individual. So all these type of things require process, require documentation, and you need to keep this documentation in your organization so when a regulator comes, they can actually see that you've been doing the right thing. So it's not enough to just say you're doing the right thing, you actually have to prove it now. So this sort of thing of accountable privacy management is something that now American or Japanese or other companies have to do, at least for the European data, if they deliver goods and services to Europeans. And one of the interesting consequences of this also for the audience here is that although there might be differences between American and Japanese regimes, how they've been dealing with privacy, they now have to cater to a common framework, the European one, which means there are probably going to be some ways in which these converge, in which they become closer, and it's probably going to lift up the privacy practices even for US data, because if you run two different regimes, the one that is related to the European rules and one that's related to the US rules, that is going to become very difficult, it's going to become very expensive. So most people are going to, often where possible, adopt the strictest one, which is the European one. So they're all becoming a little more, so the European view is probably going to really become very important in the world. That's what people predict.
You know, they have to be careful about competition. And while we can say we aren't your competition, which I truly believe we are not, we deal with mass transportation. We have the big infrastructure, which they just don't have. We do believe that if we were to come together, that we would be able to provide great service, because what we don't do well is the first and last mile, the small little trips, the off routes, those kinds of things. So we try really hard to work with them, and with both Uber, Lyft in particular, to open up the dialogue, which is starting to open up somewhat, to being able to share that data. And they are concerned. I mentioned that we're governed by several different regulations, one being, you know, we have the Federal Information Act, right, as well as within California, we have the Sunshine Law, which means that really any citizen, anybody, can ask for any piece of information, be it a document, a report, data, from us and receive it. Now, when I say any, I can qualify that as well. Of course, we don't have to give security sensitive information. In other words, I'm not going to tell just anybody where all my peering points in my network are and all those types of things. Similarly, I do have the ability to market as proprietary information from another company, which which we would do. But still, that trust has to be there. I would also prefer not to have it in my data warehouse, that someone host it for me. I'm okay with that. I don't need to own it, I need access to it. I think someone else even spoke to me wanting access to those data sets to utilize in providing our service. So it's an interesting discussion. Again, people are coming to the table with their own interests and motivations in mind, which is the barriers we really need to cut through, as well as the trust barriers. We aren't there yet. Largely, we are making strides in that space.
So maybe a public interest in a RESTful API from some of those vendors in the near future might be helpful. There was another question over here.
Yeah, actually, I tried to ask about the GDPR because this is a big issue recently. And just I say, 2 weeks ago I was in Abu Dhabi. The people sharing about GDPR problems. There is 2 issues. I think, of course, there is tons of the issue, but I just raised 2 of them. The first one, I think everybody know, particularly the attorney, the lawyer, they know. The GDPR actually is very possible to violate the sovereignty issues. Because if I, whatever, in US selling a product to Europe, and then the European try to use the GDPR to sue me, but I'm in US, I should be under the US law, not under the European law. Let's say more quicker. The people were asking the question is how the European GDPR can apply in Russia or China. Go ahead, do it, show us. And I think that's the GDPR problem. 2 weeks ago, I'm talking about in Abu Dhabi, the people really challenge is the domestic law. Well, you might be not saying the European Commission is the domestic, but somehow. How we can apply the domestic law to the other government or country sovereignty? That's the first question. The second question.
Let's limit that to the first one. Give Thomas a chance to discuss extraterritoriality, as we lawyers would want to tag it, and the reach of the GDPR and essentially the enforcement, the likelihood of enforcement being effective across jurisdictions and sort of what the current dialogue is around that. Your thoughts, Thomas?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a technologist, but I would venture that those companies, those large companies that are established in Europe, that have offices in Europe, that the Europeans can get at them.
Sure.
And so, and those that don't, then I think I agree, it becomes a little difficult. And also if you mentioned China and Russia, if they're not cooperating, it's going to become very difficult. And it is certainly the case that following privacy rules can also become a disadvantage. It becomes a cost for those who are doing it.
Yeah.
So
let me cover a little bit further about that question. Because I think the GDPR applied to outside of the European Commission, they really create a disadvantage and advantage. For example, if you GDPR cannot touch to the Russia and China, let's mean they have an advantage because I don't care, okay? But for example, for some of the country, might be not in the European Commission, but in the Europe, they are much weaker, not as strong compared with the European Commission. They have to apply or they will get punished. Just in the old days, the US always using the 301 to threat the trading. So actually, GDPR actually created unfair trading in the world.
that's an interesting opinion, of course. I would just comment on it. I just want to counter it with something positive. What the GDPR also does is it forces a lot of players, and I would say the cooperative players, the good players probably mostly, it forces them to put good privacy practices in place, to review their security practices, how they design products so that they build privacy from the start. So for a lot of people, it is going to lift up the level of data protection and privacy in many countries and many places in the world. So I personally believe it's a wonderful step. But I agree, you're mentioning some disadvantages, and that is certainly very reasonable.
So as the law professor on the panel, I'd also like to point out that the area of internet law has been struggling with extraterritoriality and personal jurisdiction and issues like that for a number of years. Certainly an exciting conversation, but sadly today we only had about an hour for this panel. But I would encourage everyone to continue to look at this topic. It certainly is influential in the policy space. There is a lot going on right now, but they do play off historical trends. This is not, happening in isolation. There's, at least, 30 years of experience in the space of privacy alone. Security is a deep topic as well, and some might bifurcate that. But they all sort of play off, the general international public law and private law sort of environments that are playing through. Do we have time for maybe one more question? Or great. So if we could thank the panel and give them a round of applause.